They didn't feel tired, not in a way that stood out. They were still doing everything they needed to do, getting up, going where they were expected to go, replying to messages, holding conversations, keeping things moving. Nothing had stopped, nothing had broken. If someone had asked them directly, they would have said they were fine, and in a way they were. But there was a quiet difference in how things felt, a slight heaviness that didn't have a clear reason, a slower response to things that used to feel easy, a sense that everything required just a little more effort than before. Not enough to question, just enough to be there. At first, it was easy to overlook. A message left unanswered for a little longer than usual. A task that took more time to begin. A moment where they paused before doing something they had done many times before. Nothing unusual, just small delays. And small delays are easy to explain. They had been busy. They hadn't slept as well. There was more to think about lately. All reasonable, all temporary. So they moved past it. Because tiredness, in the way people usually recognize it, tends to be obvious. It looks like exhaustion. It feels like needing rest. It interrupts things. This wasn't like that. This kind of tiredness didn't interrupt anything. It sat quietly underneath everything instead. They still showed up, they still responded, they still did what was expected. But the effort behind it had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. Which they weren't, because when nothing stops, there is no clear reason to look closer. The days continued, and within them small things began to shift. They noticed they were choosing quieter options more often, saying no gently to things they would have said yes to before, preferring to stay where they were instead of going somewhere else, letting conversations end a little earlier. Not as a decision, just as a preference. It felt easier that way. At the same time, things that used to feel neutral began to feel slightly heavier. Simple tasks, routine decisions, even small interactions. Nothing overwhelming, just less light than before. They didn't describe it as tiredness, because tiredness suggests something that needs to be fixed, something that requires rest or change or attention. And this didn't feel urgent. It felt manageable, so they continued. People around them didn't notice anything unusual, because from the outside everything still looked the same. They were still present, still functioning, still participating. There were no clear signs of struggle, only small adjustments. And small adjustments are easy to miss, even for the person making them. Time moved forward the way it always does, and the quiet heaviness remained, not growing dramatically, not disappearing either, just staying. There were moments when it became slightly more noticeable, a conversation that felt harder to follow, a task that required more focus than expected, a feeling of wanting things to pause just briefly. But those moments passed, and when they passed, everything returned to something that looked like normal. So they kept going, because nothing had told them to stop. And then, one day, something small happened. Not important, not significant enough to mark on a calendar, just a moment. They sat down after finishing something simple, and instead of moving straight on to the next thing, they paused. Not intentionally, just slower than usual. And in that pause, something became clearer. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to notice the effort, the quiet, constant effort that had been there for some time, holding things together, keeping things moving, responding, participating, continuing. They hadn't realized how much of it there was, because it had been spread out across everything, thin enough to go unnoticed, until they stopped for a moment and felt all of it at once. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was present, and for the first time they recognized it, not as stress, not as something wrong, just as tiredness, A kind that doesn't announce itself, a kind that doesn't interrupt, a kind that simply becomes part of how things feel. They didn't react strongly. There was no sudden decision to change everything, no dramatic realization, just a quiet shift in understanding. They had been moving through their days carrying something they hadn't fully noticed, and now they noticed it. After that, not much changed on the surface. They still did what they needed to do, still showed up, still moved through their routines, but something was slightly different. The awareness stayed, and with it, small moments began to appear. Moments where they paused a little earlier, rested a little longer, chose something slightly lighter instead of something heavier, not as a correction, just as a response. Because once something is noticed, it doesn't need to be forced. It simply becomes part of how you move. The tiredness didn't disappear, but it didn't feel invisible anymore either. And that made a difference. Not a dramatic one, just enough to soften the edges of things. Just enough to make space where there hadn't been space before. Which leaves the question hanging, not inside the story, but outside it, with you. When things feel slightly heavier than usual, how quickly do you notice it? What helps you recognize when you might be more tired than you realized? How do you usually respond when something feels just a little harder than it used to? What does rest look like for you when nothing seems obviously wrong?